Hello world of YouTube, and welcome to a discography review on Swedish rock band The Hives. A review that I decided to do last year upon the release of their comeback record, The Death of Randy Fitzsimmons, and sort of solidified that I was doing it after making a poll of it on Instagram. I just wanted to sit with Randy Fitzsimmons for a little while and see where I would fit it in the band's discography. Now, I decided to do this not because I would say I'm like a colossal Hives fan. I do think that they are a pretty consistent rock band on top of having a well-defined and just very well understood amongst the members of the band's style and approach to making music that I think makes for a very consistent discography. I also think that it helps that they've seemingly just kind of been the best of pals the entire time. They've only had one member shakeup, and it was their bassist, Dr. Matt Destruction, who left only because of health issues. I mean, like, the core unit of the band of Pelle Almqvist, Nicholas Arson, Vigilante Karlstrom, Chris Dangerous, and their new bassist, the Johan and Only, are this just well-contained force of energy that they've forged throughout their 6-album run over the last 20 plus years, almost 30 years at this point. My goal today is to not only rank their 6 albums, but also give you guys a roadmap for those that would like to get into the Hives that haven't on an album-to-album scale. However, before I get into their 6 albums, they do have one EP worth of note from earlier on in their career that I'm going to talk about right now. AKA IDIOT is an EP the band dropped around the time of their debut and features a song from that debut and from Veni Vidi Vicious, along with 3 cuts that I think also ended up on that Your New Favorite Rock Band compilation. Feel like a nice little sort of rounding out of this, again, just really straightforward, energetic track that sort of acts as like an expansion on some of those proof-of-concept ideas planted on Barely Legal. I feel like if you like that album, you like Veni Vidi Vicious, this is a fun sort of thing to listen to if you haven't spun Your New Favorite Rock. There's a fieriness that Pelle screams with on a track like the breakdown of Untutored Youth that I think embodies that sort of youthful tongue-in-cheekness that, again, the band throttles with excellently throughout the discography, but is in an interesting sort of tangent on here. Let's talk about the records proper. Really the big barometer for me when it came to ranking their discography, because they have such an idiosyncratic approach to making records, is the banger to non-banger ratio, like the real pivoting of energy across the runtime of an album that the band does, because the Hives all have very short, sweet albums that just kind of fly through and, you know, give the listener this vibrant, expressive, energetic frenzy. However, on Lex Hives, their last record until last year saw the band at their most tepid, their least bombastic, and their most homogenized in a way that was honestly really disappointing to hear, given this is one of a couple records I hadn't spun prior to doing research for this review. Hell, it wasn't until Take Out the Toys really came in with its razor-sharp bass line that I felt like I was really engaged with a more Hives-like experience. Sure, everything building up to that point feels like a Hives record to some degree. You know, Patrolling Days has this chorus that I think Pelle really sells. Tracks like 1,000 Hours and These Spectacles reveal the nostalgics. Definitely feel like they're evoking the spirit of especially early Hives to some capacity. It just doesn't have the same gusto and gumption that I like from records that I put much higher above this in the ranking. One of the laziest songs in the band's career is the opener, Come On, and I don't think it leads into Go Right Ahead all that swell as well. And that's the other thing with this record. The Hives are incredible at album sequencing when it comes to blurring these experiences to give the listener this really nice sit with an album. Lex Hives is probably the least cohesive project and their catalog on top of that. That's not to say that the Hives are obviously this huge, super deep, prolific band, but when it comes to like lyrically being a little more dazzling and exciting, or using grand imagery to accent the high energy, Lex Hives doesn't really do that all that much throughout its track listing, and I think also kind of weighs it down. There's not a through line or anything to sort of hook me in the same way that I feel like a lot of their highest highs do. A perfectly fine rock album in its own breath, but it feels like the least interesting output from the band, on top of being the poorest from a sequencing perspective, and just not necessarily evoking the same energy that the band would on every album above this. It's for morbid curiosity, if anything, at the end of the day. You know, if you're getting into the Hives and you're like, you know what, I've liked all 5 of these records, how bad could Lex Hives be? You're not going to walk away hating your experience, but I do think that there's, like, a little bit of a step down, by and large, on this project that I don't think is felt on the rest of their discography. While released amidst the era that was the rising fame of the Hives, I think Tyrannosaurus Hives, when talking about like my rubric of critique for this band, while featuring some bangers like Two Time and Touch of Broken Bones and other singles like Walk Idiot Walk, which feels like it's sort of expanding on the energy from a track from earlier on their career, aka Idiot. I also love the writing on tracks like B for Brutus and some of the other Sonic, and on Dead Quote Olympics, along with some of the other Sonic deviations that sort of crop up on here, like the unsettling ideas behind Diabolic Scheme. They help enhance those lyrics tenfold, along with some of the guitar sort of experimentation on Love and Plaster. But as far as meeting that benchmark, or as far as like creating an experience that has those higher highs, I think that around this era, they were just making better albums. I mean, there's a reason I feel like around the time of this album's release, they also dropped a compilation called Your New Favorite Rock Band that had a reorganization of songs not from Tyrannosaurus Hives, but from Veni Vidi Vicious, Barely Legal, and that aka IDIOT EP that I already talked about, which is an interesting compilation and sort of a re-cobbling of their earlier records. But even that, you know, sort of has moments that I think hit harder and go, you know, for broke more than some of Tyrannosaurus Hives. I think it's a much more cohesive experience than Lex Hives, and I think that the production feels very in line with the band more so than on Lex Hives, and feels more snugly within their discography. I feel like if you enjoy records like the Black and White album and Veni Vidi Vicious, you should check out Tyrannosaurus Hives if you haven't, because as far as a great through line sonically, sequencing-wise, this is sort of within the wheelhouse that I love of this band, and I think that their sort of unity as a band is more realized on here than it was on Lex Hives. It's just a more consistent release as a whole. I think it's a sleeper record potentially in their discography, even if I am ranking it this low, but that's because the shit that I like more than this, I think just, again, goes for broke more and hits the rafters more consistently. While the lean energy is felt on here, there's just a little more I kind of wish was going on in this. I feel like it's a decent stepping stone or place to get to eventually, but I definitely also don't think it's a good starting point as a whole. I wouldn't necessarily say I was surprised that I liked the Death of Randy Fitzsimmons so much. I did put it on my top 50 albums of last year. However, to see this band, after so much time apart, come back and basically step like they never missed a beat was something that I had a lot of appreciation for, because so many bands that I used to listen to would come back and they would have these releases that felt like faint glimmers or like passé versions of what they'd done in the past. However, not only do they have these fun flips on death throughout parts of the track listing, like some of the stage setting on the opener, Bogus Operandi, or having just tongue-in-cheek shit like Rigor Mortis Radio, or even taking that into the build-up of death, the reflections on fame, or how the potentially output of the band 20 years ago could have led to the place that they're at now, like Crash Into the Weekend, or The Way the Story Goes. They still keep that sort of bigger-than-life, relatively, you know, apocalyptic energy throughout tracks like the bass-driven Countdown to Shutdown, or the razor-sharp The Bomb. I think that this very much evokes the spirit of the Hives' golden career, much more than Lex Hives may have been trying to 11 years prior to this release. I also like how it found a way to sort of incorporate some of the tangent seen on a record like Lex Hives a little more gracefully, like on Stick Up. I love the bombast and swing of that track. It's so fucking good. While the production is a little more modernized, it feels like a dirtying up of a band who already had some dirty-coded roots in a modern sense. I really enjoyed this record, respinning it to see where I fit with it in the band's discography. I was honestly kind of torn between this place or the next spot in the ranking, but I do think that them coming back with a record this strong is super fucking awesome. And I think that, like, being a point people should listen to with this band, I feel like if you enjoyed some of the fire energy on, like, Vinny Vinny Vicious, you should spin The Death of Randy Fitzsimmons, because it very much evokes that, but in sort of an aged sense. It's still tongue-in-cheek, it's still razor-sharp as hell, and the bombast isn't lost. They're just a little bit further down the line in life, which I think is kind of the best way bands can do a comeback sometimes. While I'm all about reinvention through a comeback from time to time, sometimes stuff like this just rips, and this is a testament to that in practice. Their debut, Barely Legal, is another point that I hadn't really gotten to in the band's discography prior to this video, but it's absolutely one that I think electrifies from the start, and I think what set it above their most recent record for me was, or is, not only that youthful energy that I think embodies the spirit of this band as a whole. You know, the band doesn't take themselves super seriously, even if they have these larger-than-life or, like, global scale ideas to their lyrics. At the end of the day, they are just a batch of really good musicians coming together and making some razor-sharp rock tunes. And the sequencing on this and the framework of it being like this band doing this bombastic show on a late-night gig, I think very much feels in spirit of the band more so than some of those larger-than-life ideas. And it also incorporates some of the stuff from that earlier EP well into this track listing. Everything just fits so snugly together, and it's just this whirlwind of energy that's trading back and forth with, again, some fun tongue-in-cheek lyrics like on AKA Idiot or King of Ass Kissing. It's as juvenile as the band was at the time, and I think that it's a great reflection of that. I also feel like if you hadn't checked out their first album and you've loved their golden age material, it's absolutely worth your time, especially if you've spun that your new favorite rock band compilation, because parts of it are on here and I think fit better within the context of this band crashing a late night to play an extended set a little more beautifully. You know, it's a lot of, you know, there's sort of a rebelliousness to this record that I think also just kind of feels in spirit with the band. You know, there's a reason why 10 years after this, they were writing jams for Cartoon Network about how school is just a construct made by your parents and the man to keep you from having fun. Shit like that song feels more fleshed out on a album scale on this debut. I think the big thing that sets this below the upper echelon of the discography as far as like the 2-in-1 spot is the production. I do love this raw production style, and I think that it's more interesting than the sort of modern fuzziness that's added to the Death of Randy that I think is a part of the Death of Randy Fitzsimmons, but I think that still those components set it below what I would say is some of just the best garage rock to drop amidst the 2000s. There's still a lot of really cool stuff here, and I would even argue potentially this is a pretty solid starting point if you haven't listened to the Hives before, because it gives you their sort of mission statement as a band, a good proof of concept for what they could achieve, but in a much more juvenile, raw, whirlwind sense. That also, I think, just acts as a pretty damn good debut it as a whole. You know, they still got moments where they're talking about life and death and the gamble of it all in a sort of rock and roll sense like on Blackjack, but it doesn't have, again, that same scale. Everything just feels a lot more intimate in a really good way that I think works well for this band, and absolutely, I think, was the best kind of starting point this band could have asked for.
Tick, 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 tick.
Similarly to the 3 and the 4 spot, I was also kind of torn with where I was going to lay out the 1 and 2 spot. I went back and forth, because as far as meeting my criteria, as far as like the Hives excelling at their greatest, these 2 records definitely accomplished them, but in kind of different ways. And I think that the Black and White album is a fantastic record from these guys. I mean, you've got the stage setting, again, sort of peak of reaching those stratosphere that they were building to throughout the 2000s brilliantly with Tick Tick Boom. I think it's an incredible song that sort of slows down the energy a little bit, but keeps that bombast on 10, which is sort of a through line that this record kind of dances with, you know, because a handful of the tracks after that don't keep the energy super fast. They keep it kind of in a mid-tempo realm, but they dance around where they take the listener, whether it's the more straightforward "You Got It All Wrong" or the swagger between tracks like "Try It Again" and "Well, All Right." I also like how this album does try to be a little more ambitious with some of its deviations, like the very interlude styles behind the electronic groove of a stroll through Hive Manor corridors. It creates this sort of uneasy atmosphere that I think helps introduce some of the chopped up guitars on Won't Be Long pretty strongly, or on the funked up The Hives, which very much feels like where parts of like pop were dancing in the mid to late 2000s, but doesn't lose that Hives flavor within the lyrics that I think is fucking awesome. I also love that they bring back some of those larger-than-life ideas on a track like "You Dress Up for Armageddon," which is another just Hives banger. While maybe not as, like, vacuum-sealed as some of the records I've talked around this era, and admittedly its length is what put it in the number 2 spot, I think that with that length, they at least spread their wings more than they did on Lex Hives in a more gratifying manner. I enjoy what's going on here, and think that, like, as far as continuing to show growth and trajectory in a band, this was how they should have done it. And I don't necessarily think one needs to start here, but again, similarly to a record like Tyrannosaurus Hives, I think that it is a good stepping stone place to get to. While I do kind of wish there was a little more of a ramp up in energy throughout pockets of this, I think that the deviations they do on here make for a more interesting experience at the end of the day.
Hate to say I told you so, alright.
Veni Vidi Vicious, though, takes that energy from Barely Legal, polishes it up a little bit while adding more catchiness and just those Hives bangers to the cocktail. They kick it open with this just incredible edgy jam. The Hives declare guerre nucléaire, which I'm assuming is something about nuclear bombs because it's in the lyrics, but it sort of creates that larger-than-life scale that they would skirt around with from this point forward, and really runs with it to the horizons. You know, when I'm talking about, like, sequencing within a record, this record is so perfectly sequenced. Every track just blurs together wonderfully, while also having some incredibly catchy, like, bigger, catchier tracks than on Barely Legal, like Die Alright, Main Offender. Obviously, Hate to Say I Told You So is arguably one of the band's biggest songs, and I'm amazed that on a record this incredibly paced, this track is a middle-of-the-record banger, but it still, again, fits so snugly with where it's at, following the electrifying Outsmarted and the Hives introduce the metric system. Another track that I think, again, just has this tongue-in-cheek writing that I love so much from these guys. If I'm talking, like, the embodiment of this band's mission statement, pulled together in a moment that would act as the sort of inspirational pivot point for the band that I think is them at their peak, it is Veni Vidi Vicious. If I think there is a point that you should start with in the band, it is Veni Vidi Vicious, because it, as far as like the metrics that I've been critiquing this band on the entire time, this is all of that at its best here. The production is still gritty, but has moments where each element really pops. The bass play on here is just super great, and I think that the production helps that bass pop in a way that doesn't quite happen throughout pockets of the discography in ways that I wish. I think that as far as like being the real make or break moment for this band, Veni Vidi Vicious is that, but they capitalized on it in the best way they could have. They followed up what is a youthful, fiery debut with a little bit more of a refined, but still youthful and fiery experience that I think is a little bit more lyrically interesting and also just a little more sonically important than Barely Legal, and would sort of help branch out the garage rock scene as it had become before it had become this gargantuan thing within the rock scene wonderfully. I love this record, and I think that as far as like the biggest thing for me that kept it here is that it is a tight 27-minute jam session that is just in and out with a lot of really good songs. And there's also a reason why I think it's a good starting point, because the Hives, at their best, in my opinion, outside of some of the deviations on the Black and White album, are tongue-in-cheek, fiery, bombastic, and just a little bit chaotic. They even take the time to have this fun little side deviation in Find Another Girl, which has this like beachy atmosphere that washes in to break up the energy so fucking perfectly. And that's how I would rank the Hives discography. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know your thoughts on the Hives and your favorite record by them in the comments down below. If you did like this discography review, give it a like. If you want to see more, consider subscribing. I drop 2 to 4 vids a week depending on what I've got going on. Thank you again so very much for watching. I am Viral Rack. You guys have good days, lives, and situations, and I'll see you another day.